Welcome, everyone. I am Reverend Bridget Fiddler, and I am the chair of the Historic Connecticut Conference Board of Directors. And this is a conversation, a forum about the bylaw changes that we have approved, and we wanted to hold this forum for a number of reasons. The first is that we feel it's very important that there be transparency, so that there is no question about what we're doing, that we are doing everything above board, but that it's also making an effort for this to be understandable. We also have an accountability to our membership, and we want to be sure that that is understood and clear as well. And we are building on our history. This is not a radical departure. For us, this is really a continuation of the history of the United Church of Christ in the congregational way, and creating and developing new things in the spirit that God calls us to move. This is our response to that hearing of the Spirit. And we are creating something that is, well, it's bigger, yes, but it isn't, but it is a bigger us, and a more of a gaining than of a loss of any kind. So we see this collaboration as something positive and powerful, as a way of having God's voice be more loud and powerful in our world, which is so sorely needed today. So thank you for being here or listening later at a different time. We have Kent Salati with us here, the conference minister, Fred Ward, who is a member of our board, and Charlie Kuchenbrod, who is a staff member at the conference office. Is there anyone there that I missed?
Nope, you've got everybody.
Okay, great.
We have some attendees, so we're glad you're here as well and looking in. We're glad you joined us. And we're also, I believe, broadcasting on Facebook Live, so this will have a wider audience of viewers. Okay.
So we are going to go through some questions that we have prepared ahead of time, that we thought would be questions that people might have or ask. Is that the best way we want to go through this? Okay. So the bylaws, for your information, are available at the Connecticut Conference website. So please be sure to have those in front of you at some point, or to read them. They have been very clearly outlined, and the questions are, I think, ones that are very helpful in understanding this process. One of the questions we thought of were, what are the roles of the Missionary Society of Connecticut and the trustees for the fund of ministry? And so to understand the differences in these bodies and how historically that they have come about, and what their different functions are. So I'm not necessarily going to read the answers to these, but I'm wondering if there are questions that people have about the functions of the various different parts of what has been the Connecticut Conference of the United Church of Christ.
I'm going to interrupt Bridget and tell our attendees that the way to ask questions is you should have a toolbar towards the bottom of your screen, and one of them will say chat. And if you open up a chat box, you can type questions to us that we will see. or so that's the best way to get a question to us.
I think it might be helpful for everyone to know what are the two entities that Bridget is talking about, the Missionary Society of Connecticut and the Trustees for Fund for Ministers. Those are actually the legal corporate entities of the Connecticut Conference of the United Church of Christ. These bylaws provide for the continuation of those two entities moving forward as we form the Southern New England Conference. So those entities are historic, and the bylaws provide for the continuation of those two entities. Charlie, why don't you say a word about what each of those entities actually does? I think that would be interesting to talk about.
The Missionary Society of Connecticut is the operating arm of the Connecticut Conference. It employs all the staff, holds all of the assets, and most of the activities you think about as Connecticut Conference takes place under the legal umbrella of the Missionary Society of Connecticut. The Trustees of the Fund for Ministers is a set of endowments, restricted gifts that are dedicated to helping clergy, both active and retired. It's unique to Connecticut, I believe, within the United Church of Christ, and goes back to the 1860s. So those are the two organizations that together constitute the activities of the Connecticut Conference.
Thank you, Charlie. Does anyone have any questions about those entities? Okay. We are amending these bylaws for the Missionary Society of Connecticut and adopting bylaws for the Trustees Fund for Ministers. These are membership organizations, corporations, and the current membership is the Board of Directors of the Connecticut Conference of the United Church of Christ. These members also serve as the Board of Directors for the Missionary Society and for the Trustee Fund for Ministers. So when the Southern New England Conference will replace the Connecticut Conference, Connecticut Conference will be dissolved, and that will leave the Missionary Society of Connecticut and the Trustee Fund for Ministers. And so they will continue to operate in their functions. So the Missionary Society of Connecticut operates and owns actual property for the Connecticut Conference. So that would include 125 Sherman Street, as well as Silver Lake Conference Center. And they are also the trustees of, for the Southern New England Conference to facilitate the formation of the, I'm sorry, they are also the trustee of the fund, the investing arm of the conference. So the Trustees Fund for Ministers is a collection of endowments that supports the ministry of the conference. And TFM will remain independent of the Southern New England Conference. It does not have bylaws. It never has had bylaws. Whereas the Missionary Society of Connecticut had to have its bylaws amended to facilitate the formation of this new conference. The question about who will be members of the Missionary Society of Connecticut and the Trustee Fund for Ministers. The delegates to the Southern New England Conference associated with the churches and associations of the Historic Connecticut Conference will be the members. So you might just think of this as transferring the members of the Connecticut Conference to the Missionary Society and to the Trustee Fund for Ministers. And the rules for the Southern New England Conference are not identical to the rules for the Connecticut Conference. So the two groups are not identical, but there is a large overlap. There is also a similar for the Missionary Society of Connecticut and Southern New England Conference, an overlap in terms of its vision and mission. Those who will serve on the board of directors for the Missionary Society of Connecticut and the Trustee Fund for Ministers will be the directors of the Southern New England Conference. In other words, if you are on the Southern New England Conference Board of Directors and you are from a church or an association that was part of the Historic Connecticut Conference, then you will automatically, by virtue of your position, be a director on the Missionary Society of Connecticut or the Trustee Fund for Ministers. And the composition of the boards for those two entities, Missionary Society of Connecticut and Trustee Fund for Ministers, will be identical as they have been for decades. As I said earlier, the Trustee Fund for Ministers is not part of the Southern New England Conference. So the question would be, why would you then have directors serving on both boards? And the way we basically looked at that was that the Missionary Society of Connecticut and the Trustee Fund for Ministers also were basically integrated and operated as one. We basically changed hats during a meeting and did the business for each of those entities. The current Connecticut Conference Board of Directors decided to emphasize the interdependence between these entities rather than the independence of them. If the members of the Missionary Society of Connecticut and the Trustee Fund for Ministers are not electing directors, are there any member protections included in the bylaws? Yes, we have included some protections. They are different for the Missionary Society of Connecticut than they are, and for TFM, due to the differences in their relationships to the Southern New England Conference. So there is some overlap. For both organizations, members are entitled to attend an annual meeting or receive a report in lieu of an annual meeting. And it will be up to the board of directors to decide whether to have a meeting or to issue the report. For both organizations, the members must approve the transfer endowments with market values in excess of $150,000 and to approve the transfer or the sale of any other asset with market value exceeding $1 million. We do recognize that the Trustee Fund for Ministers is independent of the Southern New England Conference, and the TFM members will have some additional rights. They will have the right to call special meetings of the members. They may be through a written request from 20 delegates, or upon the written request of 2 associations, or upon the written request of the majority of at-large directors. Any business, including the call to the meeting, could be put before the members to act upon. At these special meetings, the members could enlarge the board of directors by creating at-large director positions and electing members to these positions. And at special meetings, the members could also remove and replace directors who serve by virtue of their position on the Southern New England Board. The creation of at-large directors or the removal and replacement of the directors who serve by virtue of their position would mean that the board of directors for the TFM would be different from the board of directors for MSC. And these provisions provide the members to put more emphasis on independence if the members discern that the MSC or Southern New England Conference interests are being given too much weight at the expense of TFM interests. So there is a protection in there for those assets, and that we would have some ability to interact or to have some say in regard to them. Are there any questions, concerns that people have?
I have given permission for our attendees to talk. They may have to unmute. We can't spy on them by opening up a microphone from this end. But if anybody would like to ask a question, you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
So while our viewers are thinking of questions they might want to ask, I want to just give sort of another perspective as to what you're being asked to consider at the annual meeting. And that is, when we began the conversations about forming the Southern New England Conference, one of the things that was raised as a concern was the protection of endowed assets and real property. Those were the two major concerns that we heard loud and clear from our conference folks. And so these entities, these bylaw changes, either the new bylaws created for the Trustees for Fund for Ministers or the revision and recommendation of the revisions for the Missionary Society of Connecticut, do just that. They provide an opportunity for the Historic Conference of Connecticut, which will no longer be the Connecticut Conference, but will act under these two umbrella organizations, to protect those assets, to protect the real property, as Bridget mentioned, Silver Lake and 125 Sherman Street, which are conference offices, and to protect historic endowed funds, which have limitations by the donor. And we wanted to make sure that we built a wall of trust between those who have left us historic endowments and the proper use of those funds. So really why we didn't put everything into a single new conference was to protect the assets and real property. That in essence is really the shorthand of what we're attempting to do with these bylaw changes. And I think that's a really simplistic overview of a lot of verbiage that you'll find in the two bylaws of the TFM and MSC. But that's really what this will accomplish by vote of the delegates to the annual meeting on the Connecticut part of that meeting, which is Friday night. So are there questions from any of you who have joined us on this meeting? Let me also say, not everybody's ready to ask a question this way. So we want to give you an opportunity. If you do have a question that you want to ask later, if we didn't answer something that you hoped we would answer, please send an email. You can send that directly to me, Kents, @ctucc.org, and I will get it to my colleagues, and we will do our best to answer any questions that you might have. But we wanted to have this opportunity at this point to answer any questions you might be bringing this evening. Are there any questions? Allison, you're unmuted. So we can't hear you, Allison, if you're trying to speak. I don't know that your microphone's working. So if you want to use the chat box to answer, to ask your question, that would be a way to, because we can't, I can't, can anyone else hear her? We
No.
can't hear you. So Allison, if you do have a question, you want to use the chat box down below and type it in, that would work. Okay, not seeing anything coming up there, Bridget. I wonder if there are any closing thoughts about what we're proposing at the meeting. Charlie, do you have anything you'd like to close with?
There's more continuity than disruption, I think, in these bylaws. And the most important thing is that the creation of the new conference makes a bigger us. There isn't an us and them between the Connecticut Conference and the Southern New England Conference. We are all us. And so that's a basic premise behind these bylaws.
And I would just like to add that a lot of thought, consideration, discernment, and prayer has gone into thinking about these amendments, how these entities will interact, how interdependence creates a better way for us to be disciples in this endeavor, and that we are always thinking about the accountability to our membership and to the people we serve, and just really wanting that to be a building and constructive process for all of us, with the transparency that there is nothing happening here behind the scenes. So I would like to thank all of you who attended this evening. I can't see you, but I am grateful for you to be here and to take the time to listen. We once again ask your questions afterwards, and please, we will see you at the annual meeting in just a couple of weeks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Blessings.
Bye-bye.